The late afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting golden patches on the hardwood floor. The soft hum of the dishwasher was the only sound in the otherwise still house. I leaned against the counter, absently stirring my cup of tea. It had been one of those quiet, uneventful days, the kind I'd grown accustomed to since the boys were little and life had slowed down to a crawl. Now, even those days felt like a distant memory. My husband, Roger, had been my rock for over 20 years. He was dependable, a good provider, and the type of man who never missed a day of work. But the qualities I once admired had slowly morphed into the chains that bound me. Lately, he seemed more married to his job than to me, his conversations filled with spreadsheets and corporate meetings rather than asking about my day. The rare moments we spent together were stiff and perfunctory, like actors in a play we had long stopped rehearsing. I sighed and looked at the clock on the microwave. It was barely 4 in the afternoon, and the house already felt too quiet. Roger wouldn't be home until late, as usual. I rinsed my mug and walked into the living room, where the sunlight danced lazily on the cream-colored walls. The quiet was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. My stepson Ethan stepped inside, his gym bag slung over one shoulder. He kicked off his sneakers near the door and ran a hand through his damp hair. "Hey," he said casually, his voice low and warm, the way young men's voices often are. "Hey," I replied, my lips curving into an automatic smile. Ethan had only recently moved back in with us after graduating from college, taking a break before deciding on his next step in life. At 22, he was still figuring things out, but his presence in the house was a welcome change from the monotony of my days. He dropped his bag by the stairs and walked toward the kitchen. "Do we have anything to eat? I'm starving." "There's some leftover pasta in the fridge," I said, following him into the room. Watching him move, I was struck by how much he'd grown. He wasn't the awkward teenager I remembered. He was now a man, broad-shouldered, confident, and easy in his skin. "Cool, thanks," he said, pulling the container out and popping it into the microwave. He leaned against the counter, his shirt clinging to his chest and arms, the fabric slightly damp from his workout. "You're always here when I get back. Don't you ever get bored?" I chuckled softly, though his question hit closer to home than he probably intended. "Not really. Someone has to hold the fort down, right?" He shrugged. "Still, it seems kinda lonely." I didn't respond right away, instead focusing on the hum of the microwave. Lonely. The word lingered in the air between us, unspoken yet heavy. He probably didn't realize how right he was. After Ethan ate, he disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone again with my thoughts. I wandered into the living room and sat by the window, watching as the world outside carried on without me. The couple next door were setting up their patio furniture for a barbecue. Their laughter floated through the open window, a cruel reminder of the intimacy my own life lacked. I picked up a book from the coffee table, flipping through its pages without really reading. My thoughts drifted to Ethan. He had always been polite and respectful, but lately there was something different about the way he interacted with me, the way his gaze lingered a second too long, the way he seemed to notice details about me that even Roger missed, like when I got my hair cut or wore a new dress. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just a byproduct of having another adult in the house. The sound of the shower running upstairs broke my reverie. I could hear the faint echoes of Ethan singing to himself, a carefree melody that made me smile despite myself. It was one of those moments that reminded me of the simpler joys of life, the kind I used to take for granted. I stood up, stretching my legs, and headed to the kitchen to start dinner. As I rummaged through the fridge, I realized how much I looked forward to the evenings now. With Roger away so often, Ethan's presence had become the highlight of my day. It was nice to have someone to talk to, even if the conversations were mostly about his job applications or stories from college. Dinner was uneventful as usual. Ethan joined me at the table and we chatted about his plans for the weekend. He mentioned meeting some friends, but made no mention of moving out anytime soon. I found myself oddly relieved. As much as I tried to dismiss the thought, the truth was, I enjoyed having him around, more than I cared to admit. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft creaks of the house settling. Roger's side of the bed was empty, as it often was these days. My mind wandered back to Ethan, his easy smile, his laughter, the way he filled the house with an energy that had been missing for years. I rolled over and closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but the stillness of the house pressed down on me, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to wonder, when had my life become so unbearably small? Let me know if this introduction captures the tone and depth you were looking for, or if you'd like me to adjust or expand on any particular element before proceeding with Act 2. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting thin stripes of light across the bedspread. I lay there, half awake, letting the quiet of the house wrap around me like a heavy blanket. Roger had left early for work, as he always did, and Ethan was still asleep upstairs. It was one of those rare moments when the house felt serene, untouched by the chaos of daily life. By mid-morning, the routine set in. I cleaned the kitchen, wiped down counters, and sorted through a mountain of laundry. It was mindless work, but it kept me busy, kept my thoughts from wandering into dangerous territory. Yet, as I folded a stack of Ethan's freshly laundered clothes, I couldn't help but notice how much his wardrobe had changed. Gone were the graphic tees and oversized hoodies of his teenage years, replaced with fitted button-downs and neatly pressed chinos. They were the clothes of a man, not a boy. I carried the stack upstairs, to his room, nudging the door open with my hip. His room was clean, a habit I had drilled into him when he was younger. Setting the clothes on the edge of his neatly made bed, I noticed his cologne bottle sitting on the dresser. I picked it up absent-mindedly, bringing it to my nose. The scent was warm and woodsy, a mix of cedar and something sweet. It lingered in the air, familiar yet foreign, and I set it down quickly, bringing a strange flutter in my chest. Shaking off the thought, I went about my day. By the time afternoon rolled around, Ethan had emerged from his room, yawning and scratching the back of his head as he made his way to the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Morning," he replied, his lips curving into a lazy smile. "You're up early?" I laughed softly. "It's almost noon, Ethan." "Right," he said with a chuckle, taking a sip of his coffee. "Guess I needed the sleep." The rest of the day passed in a blur of errand and housework. By the time evening arrived, I was exhausted but content. I was in the middle of preparing dinner when Ethan came downstairs, freshly showered, his hair still damp and curling at the ends. He was wearing a fitted gray t-shirt and a pair of athletic shorts that clung to his frame. He sat at the counter, watching me as I worked. "Need any help?" he offered. "No, I've got it," I said, glancing over my shoulder. But thanks. You do a lot, he said suddenly, his tone sincere. For the house. For Dad. I paused, caught off guard by his words. It's nothing, I said, brushing it off. It's just what I do. Well, it's not nothing, he said, his eyes meeting mine. I don't think Dad even realizes how lucky he is. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I turned back to the stove, stirring the pot of pasta sauce as my mind raced. Did he really mean that? Or was it just a passing comment? Later that evening, after dinner, I retreated to the bedroom with a book. I barely got through a page before I heard the sound of the shower running upstairs, Ethan, no doubt. The pipes groaned slightly, a familiar quirk of the old house, and I sighed, sinking deeper into the pillows. But then I realized I had left my phone charging in the bathroom. I debated whether to retrieve it, but the thought of being disconnected for the rest of the night pushed me out of bed. I padded up the stairs, the soft creak of the floorboards breaking the silence. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, steam curling out in wispy tendrils. I reached for the handle, intending to knock, but the sound of the shower curtain sliding open froze me in place. Through the gap in the door, I caught a glimpse of Ethan stepping out of the shower, a towel slung low around his hips. My breath caught in my throat. His skin was damp, droplets of water trailing down his chest and over the defined ridges of his abdomen. The steam clung to him, softening the sharp lines of his body, but doing nothing to diminish the way he seemed to fill the room. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as my eyes traced the shape of him, the broadness of his shoulders, the strength in his arms. I knew I should look away, retreat quietly, and pretend I had never been there. But I couldn't. There was something magnetic about the moment, something I couldn't explain. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I was certain he would hear it. Just as he reached for another towel to dry his hair, I snapped out of my trance and backed away, my hand trembling as it found the banister. I fled to my room, shutting the door behind me and leaning against it. My chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and I pressed a hand to my heart as if to steady it. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I look away? The image of him lingered in my mind, vivid and unshakable. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, my thoughts racing. It wasn't just that he was attractive, though there was no denying that he was. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, the unassuming charm. He reminded me of something I had forgotten, a time when I felt seen, desired. I shook my head, forcing the thought away. This was madness, a momentary lapse of judgment, nothing more. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew that something had shifted. A line had been crossed, even if only in my mind, and I wasn't sure I could ever go back. The days that followed felt like a blur, each moment tinged with an inexplicable tension that I couldn't seem to shake. Every interaction with Ethan carried a weight that hadn't been there before. I told myself it was in my head, a figment of my imagination, fueled by one fleeting moment of weakness. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it lingered, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. It didn't help that Ethan seemed utterly unaware of the storm brewing inside me. If anything, he was more relaxed around me than ever, slipping into the easy rhythm of someone who felt at home. His laughter echoed through the house when he called out to friends on his phone, and his casual touches, a hand on my shoulder, a quick brush as we passed in the hallway, felt unintentional, yet left my skin buzzing with awareness. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, Ethan came in, shirtless and damp from what I assumed was another workout. He had taken to exercising in the backyard, his movements fluid and powerful as he pushed through sets of pull-ups and planks. It was a stark contrast to Roger, whose idea of physical activity was walking to the fridge during commercial breaks. "You're always working," Ethan said, flopping onto the couch and tossing a hand towel over his shoulder. His voice had a teasing lilt, but there was genuine curiosity in his eyes. "Someone has to keep this place running," I replied, folding one of his t-shirts and setting it on the pile. "It's not like your father notices." He frowned slightly. "That's not fair to you. You deserve more than that." I froze for a moment, the shirt still in my hands. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like this, but the sincerity in his tone caught me off guard. I looked at him, his face open and earnest, and felt a pang of something I couldn't name. "Life isn't always fair," I said finally, forcing a smile. He didn't respond, but the intensity of his gaze lingered, leaving me flustered. I quickly returned my attention to the laundry, pretending not to notice the way his presence filled the room. That evening, Roger called to say he'd be working late, again. I barely reacted, my mind already preoccupied with the thought of another dinner alone with Ethan. It had become a strange routine, these shared meals where silence was replaced with easy banter. He had a way of making me laugh, of drawing me out of the shell I had built over years of neglect. As we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the conversation flowed effortlessly. He told me about his plans to visit some college friends over the weekend and joked about how they were all trying to figure out adulthood one mistake at a time. I found myself leaning forward, hanging on to his every word, drawn to the warmth in his voice and the way his eyes sparkled when he laughed. "Why don't you come with me?" he asked suddenly, his tone light but his expression serious. I blinked, caught off guard. "What? To see your friends?" "Yeah." "You never do anything for yourself," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It might be good for you to get out of the house for a change." I laughed, shaking my head. "I doubt your friends would appreciate having someone my age tagging along." He smirked. "You're not as old as you think you are. Besides, they'd probably love you." The way he said it, so matter-of-factly, sent a ripple of warmth through me. I laughed again, brushing it off, but the idea lingered long after dinner was over. The next day, a thunderstorm rolled in, bringing with it a power outage that left the house eerily silent. The flickering candles I had placed around the living room cast long shadows on the walls, and the rain beat a steady rhythm against the windows. Ethan joined me on the couch, his presence a comforting contrast to the darkness outside. "It's kind of nice, isn't it?" he said, leaning back and stretching his legs out in front of him. "No distractions, just this." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the flames of the nearest candle. "It's peaceful." We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that felt heavier than words. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the air was thick with something else, something unspoken but undeniable. I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze pulling at me like a magnet. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, his voice low. "Of course," I replied, my heart quickening. "Are you happy?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to look at him, surprised by the intensity in his expression. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes searching mine. "I mean, with everything. Your life, Dad, this house. Are you happy?" I, hesitated, unsure how to answer. And I think I've just gotten used to things being the way they are. That's not the same as being happy, he said softly. I looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. It's complicated. It doesn't have to be, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between us, charged with an energy I couldn't ignore. I felt a shiver run down my spine, though I wasn't sure if it was from the chill of the storm or the intensity of the moment. I wanted to say something, to break the spell, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood up abruptly, mumbling something about checking on the candles, and I could feel his eyes on my back as I left the room, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the conversation over and over in my mind. His question had unlocked something inside me, something I had been trying to suppress for years. Was I happy? The answer felt painfully obvious, but admitting it, to him, to myself, felt like crossing the line I wasn't ready to face. And yet, as I stared at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of his voice, the softness in his eyes when he looked at me. For the first time in years, I felt seen, as though someone had peeled back the layers I had built around myself and found the person I used to be. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the tempest raged on. The house felt different the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving the air cool and crisp, but the tension from the night before lingered. I busied myself with chores, hoping the routine would dull the sharp edge of my thoughts. But every time I passed Ethan's door or heard his footsteps on the stairs, a spark of awareness flickered to life. By midday, Ethan found me in the kitchen wiping down the counters. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed casually over his chest. "Hey," he said, his tone easy, though his eyes held something I couldn't quite place. "You okay?" I nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" He didn't reply right away, just watched me with that quiet intensity that made my pulse quicken. "You seemed a little off last night," he said finally. "I hope I didn't upset you." "No," I said quickly, too quickly. I forced a smile, turning to face him. "It's nothing, really." He tilted his head, studying me. "If you say so." I turned back to the counter, my hands moving aimlessly as I tried to regain my composure, but his presence was like a magnet, drawing my attention no matter how hard I tried to focus elsewhere. Finally, he pushed off the doorway and walked over to me, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he said softly, his voice close enough to send a shiver down my spine. "About anything." I froze, the cloth in my hand forgotten. I could feel the heat of him behind me, the faint scent of his cologne filling the air between us. My breath hitched, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay calm. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world outside the kitchen seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us and the unspoken tension that crackled in the air. And then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I turned to face him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. His eyes met mine, dark and searching, and for a moment it felt as though the ground had shifted beneath my feet. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling, but he shook his head, his gaze never leaving mine. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. I just I just wanted you to know I see you, the real you." His words were like a key turning in a lock, unlocking something inside me that I hadn't even realized was there. For years, I had felt invisible, trapped in a life that had grown too small to contain me. But in that moment, under the weight of his gaze, I felt seen in a way I hadn't been in years. I didn't know who moved first, if it was him or me, but suddenly the space between us vanished. His hand slid up my arm, his touch firm and steady, and I found myself leaning into him, drawn to the warmth and strength of him. "Is this okay?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. I hesitated, my mind racing with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. But when I looked into his eyes, all my doubts and fears melted away. "Yes," I whispered. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, as though he was afraid to push too far. But the moment our mouths met, a floodgate opened inside me. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened, growing more urgent with every passing second. The world around us disappeared, and all I could feel was him, his hands on my back, his breath against my skin, the steady rhythm of his heart beat against my chest. It was intoxicating, a heady mix of desire and longing that left me dizzy and breathless. When we finally pulled apart, I rested my forehead against his, my eyes closed as I tried to catch my breath. This is crazy," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," he said with a small smile, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face, "but it doesn't feel wrong." And the truth was, it didn't. In that moment, with his arms around me and the warmth of his body pressed against mine, nothing had ever felt more right. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We were careful, always mindful of the thin line we were walking, but the pull between us was impossible to resist. Every glance, every accidental touch felt charged with unspoken promises. One afternoon, while Roger was at work, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, when he came in and sat beside me. His thigh brushed against mine, and I felt the now familiar jolt of electricity. "Do you ever think about just leaving?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, startled by the question. "Leaving? What do you mean?" "Everything," he said, gesturing vaguely. "This house, this life, starting over somewhere new." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. The thought of leaving had crossed my mind more times than I cared to admit, but hearing him say it out loud felt dangerous. "It's not that simple," I said finally. "Maybe it could be," he said, his eyes searching mine. "If you wanted it to be." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Instead, I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me closer, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to disappear. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about his words. Could it really be that simple? Could I walk away from everything I had built? From the life I had spent decades creating, for the chance at something new? The answer should have been obvious, but as I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts drifting back to Ethan, his smile, his touch, the way he made me feel alive, I realized that nothing about this was simple, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to be. The air in the house felt charged with an energy I couldn't ignore. Days turned into weeks, and the connection between Ethan and me grew stronger. more undeniable. It was a dance we had perfected, balancing the mundane routines of daily life with the stolen moments that had become the center of my world. And yet, with each step deeper into this uncharted territory, the risk grew, and so did the weight of the secret we carried. One evening, after dinner, I stood by the sink, washing dishes as Ethan lingered at the table. Roger was out late again, leaving the house to the two of us. It had become a routine, almost an unspoken understanding between the three of us. Roger's absence gave Ethan and me the space we hadn't dared admit we needed. "You missed a spot," Ethan teased, pointing to a glass I had just dried. I laughed, tossing the dish towel at him. "If you think you can do better, be my guest." He stood, grinning, as he joined me by the sink. His shoulder brushed mine, a casual touch that sent warmth spreading through me. We worked side by side, the sound of water and clinking dishes filling the room. But the silence between us was heavy with unspoken words. "You know," he said after a while, his voice low, "I like this." "Washing dishes?" I asked with a small smile. "No," he said, turning to look at me. "Being here, with you, just this." I paused, my hand submerged in the soapy water, and met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, a vulnerability that took my breath away. "Me too," I admitted softly. The moment stretched between us, the space around us narrowing, until it felt as though the entire world had shrunk to just the two of us. Before I could stop myself, I reached up and touched his face, my thumb brushing against his cheek. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing briefly before meeting mine again. "I think about you all the time," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I try not to, but I can't help it." "Ethan," I began, but he silenced me with a kiss, soft, tentative, but filled with a depth of feeling that left me breathless. I melted into him, my hands gripping his shoulders as he pulled me closer, his warmth seeping into me and chasing away the chill that had settled in my chest for years. When we finally pulled apart, I rested my forehead against his, my breathing ragged. "We shouldn't," I whispered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. "I know," he replied, his hand still resting on my waist, "but I can't stop." Neither could I. The following weekend, Roger announced he'd be away for a conference. He left early Saturday morning, kissing me on the cheek with a distracted air before grabbing his suitcase and heading out the door. I watched his car disappear down the driveway, my heart pounding at the thought of the weekend ahead. Ethan and I spent the morning in separate rooms, each of us pretending to go about our day as though nothing had changed. But by the afternoon, the pretense became too much. I found him in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a book in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. "Hey," he said, setting the book aside. "Everything okay?" I nodded, though my stomach churned with nerves. "Yeah, just restless, I guess." He patted the space beside him, and I hesitated before sitting down. The couch dipped slightly under our combined weight, and I felt his warmth radiating off him. For a while, we sat in silence, the quiet of the house wrapping around us like a cocoon. "You ever just want to run away?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. I turned to look at him, startled by the question. "Run away? From what?" Everything, he said, his gaze fixed on some distant point. The expectations, the pressure, all of it. Just leave and start over somewhere new. I considered his words, the longing in his voice mirroring something deep within me. Sometimes, I admitted, but it's not that simple. Maybe it could be, he said, his eyes meeting mine, if you wanted it to be. The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my chest tighten. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he leaned forward, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was anything but tentative. It was urgent, desperate, as though he was trying to convey everything he couldn't say aloud. I responded in kind, my hands tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. The world around us faded. The only thing that mattered was the way he made me feel. Alive, desired, seen. That night we sat together on the back porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. The stars above us glittered like diamonds, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. "You know," Ethan said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence, "I don't think I've ever felt this happy." I turned to look at him, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. "Me neither," I admitted, the truth of the words settling over me like a revelation. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Whatever it takes, we'll figure it out." I wanted to believe him, to let myself get lost in the fantasy of a future where we could be together without fear or guilt. But deep down, I knew the reality of our situation was far more complicated. Still, as I leaned into him, his arm wrapping around me, I allowed myself to hope, if only for a little while. The next morning, the sound of Roger's car pulling into the driveway shattered the fragile bubble we had created. Panic surged through me as I hurried to put distance between myself and Ethan, my heart pounding as though I had been caught red-handed. Roger entered the house, his usual distracted air about him, and greeted me with a quick peck on the cheek. Ethan appeared moments later, his expression carefully neutral. The dynamic in the house shifted instantly, the tension between Ethan and me buried beneath a veneer of normalcy. But as I went through the motions of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The boundaries we had crossed were no longer just lines in the sand. They were scars etched into my soul, impossible to erase. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The days after Roger's return felt like a high-wire act. Every conversation, every glance exchanged between Ethan and me was laced with tension. I tried to tell myself that nothing had changed, that we could go back to how things were before. But the truth was, we had crossed a line, and there was no undoing it. Ethan was careful, keeping his distance when Roger was home. But the moments we were alone, even fleeting ones, crackled with an energy that neither of us could ignore. A touch as he passed me in the hallway, and a lingering look across the dinner table when Roger wasn't paying attention. Each one felt like a promise, a reminder of the secret we shared. It all came to a head one Saturday evening. Roger had gone out with some colleagues, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. I had spent the day cleaning, hoping to keep my mind busy, but by the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. I sat on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, staring blankly at the television. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I barely noticed when Ethan entered the room, his presence registering only when he sat beside me. "Hey," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, my heart skipping a beat at the sight of him. He was dressed casually in a t-shirt and sweatpants, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made my breath catch. "Hey," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, charged with unspoken words. I sipped my wine, hoping it would steady my nerves, but it only seemed to heighten my awareness of him. "You've been avoiding me," he said finally, his tone more matter-of-fact than accusatory. "I haven't," I said quickly, though the words felt like a lie even as they left my lips. "You have," he insisted, his gaze piercing. "And I get it. I do. But we can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. I don't know what you want me to say." I don't want you to say anything," he said, shifting closer to me. "I just want you to be honest with me, with yourself." His words hit me like a blow, and I felt my defenses crumbling. I set my wine glass down on the coffee table, my hands trembling. "Ethan, this isn't fair. To you, to me, to anyone." "Maybe not," he said, his voice soft but firm, "but I can't help how I feel, and I don't think you can either." I turned to look at him, my heart racing. The vulnerability in his eyes was almost too much to bear. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and I felt a spark shoot through me. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you don't want this, tell me to stop." I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned into him, closing the distance between us. His lips met mine, and the world around us seemed to disappear. It wasn't a soft, tentative kiss this time. It was urgent, desperate, filled with all the longing and frustration we had been holding back. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as I tangled my fingers in his hair. The kiss deepened, growing more intense with every passing second. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think about what we were doing, but my body refused to listen. We broke apart just long enough to catch our breath, and he rested his forehead against mine. "I've wanted this for so long," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "Me too," I whispered, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. The hours that followed were a blur of stolen touches and whispered promises. We didn't think about the consequences, about what would happen when the world outside our little bubble came crashing back in. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was waking up from a long, dreamless sleep. But the bubble burst sooner than I expected. The next morning, as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, I heard the front door open. My heart sank as Roger's voice carried through the house, calling my name. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression tense. "We're okay," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, him or myself. Roger entered the kitchen moments later, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Good morning," he said, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. "Good morning," I replied, my voice steady despite the panic churning in my stomach. Ethan excused himself, mumbling something about needing to make a call. I watched him go, my chest tightening with a mixture of relief and longing. Roger didn't seem to notice my distraction, too preoccupied with his plans for the day. But the reprieve was short-lived. That evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, Roger entered, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. My heart skipped a beat. About what? He hesitated, his eyes scanning my face. About Ethan. About what's been going on. I froze, the pile of laundry slipping from my hands. What do you mean? Not an idiot, he said, his voice low but firm. I've seen the way he looks at you, the way you look at him. I opened my mouth to protest, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. The truth hung in the air between us, undeniable and damning. Are you going to tell me I'm wrong? He asked, his eyes narrowing. Tears filled my eyes as I shook my head. Roger, I don't, he interrupted, his voice sharp. I don't want to hear it. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. I wanted to explain, to apologize, but I didn't know where to start. You've made your choice, he said finally, his voice quiet but laced with anger. Now you have to live with it. He left the room without another word, and I sank to the floor, my chest heaving with silent sobs. The fragile world I had built with Ethan was crumbling around me, and I had no one to blame but myself. The silence in the house was suffocating. After Roger's confrontation, I barely left the bedroom, unsure of what to say or how to move forward. Roger avoided me entirely, his usual routine punctuated by deliberate avoidance. The only sign of his presence was the faint sound of his movements downstairs, each creak of the floorboards or clink of a coffee mug a reminder of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Ethan, however, was a different story. He texted me once that night, "Are you okay?" I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. My mind raced with 1,000 scenarios, each one ending worse than the last. Had Roger seen something? Overheard a conversation? Or was it simply his intuition, piecing together the cracks in the facade we had so carefully built? The next morning, I awoke to the sound of the front door closing. Roger had left for work as usual, but the tension in the house remained, a phantom that refused to dissipate. I ventured downstairs, my steps tentative, and found Ethan in the kitchen. He was staring out the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, his posture rigid. "Morning," I said softly, my voice barely audible. He turned to look at me, his expression a mix of relief and worry. "Morning. Did you sleep?" "Not really," I admitted, pulling out a chair at the dining table. Roger, he knows, or at least he suspects. Ethan set his mug down and crossed the room to stand in front of me. What did he say? "He said he's not an idiot," I replied, my voice trembling. "He knows something's been going on, Ethan. I don't know how, but he knows." Ethan crouched down, his hands resting on my knees. "We'll figure this out, okay? No matter what happens, we'll get through it." His reassurance was comforting, but it did little to quell the fear gnawing at me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his cheek. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered. "You won't," he promised, his gaze unwavering. "I won't let that happen." The days that followed were a blur of tension and unease. Roger was colder than ever, his interactions with me clipped and mechanical. Ethan and I did our best to act normal, but the undercurrent of anxiety was impossible to ignore. Every moment felt like a ticking time bomb, the weight of our secret threatening to explode at any second. It wasn't until later that week that everything came to a head. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when Roger walked in, his expression dark. He didn't say a word, simply sat at the table and watched me. The intensity of his gaze made my hands tremble as I chopped vegetables, but I forced myself to act natural. Finally he spoke. Ethan's been spending a lot of time here. I froze, the knife in my hand hovering over the cutting board. He lives here, Roger, I said, carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. Don't play dumb, he snapped, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. I've seen the way he looks at you, the way you look at him. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Roger, it's not— Don't lie to me, he roared, slamming his hand on the table. I'm not blind and I'm not stupid. Do you think I haven't noticed the way things have changed around here? I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Tears welled in my eyes as I realized there was no way out of this. No way to explain or excuse what had happened. You disgust me, he said, his voice low and filled with venom. Both of you. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made my stomach drop, and I turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway. His expression was a mix of anger and defiance, and he squared his shoulders as he stepped into the room. Don't talk to her like that, he said, his voice steady. Roger stood, his fists clenched at his sides. Stay out of this, Ethan. This doesn't concern you. Hell it doesn't, Ethan shot back. You think you can just bully her like this? You've ignored her for years, treated her like she's invisible, and now you want to act like you care? Don't you dare lecture me, Roger snarled, taking a step toward him. You have no idea what you've done, what you've ruined. That's enough, I shouted, my voice breaking as I stepped between them. Both of you, stop! The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. I turned to Roger, my chest heaving with the effort of holding back tears. I'm sorry, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for this to happen. Roger's face twisted with anger and pain. You think that makes it better? You think an apology fixes this? I don't know, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I don't know how to fix this. Roger shook his head, his expression hardening. You've made your choice. Don't expect me to stick around and watch you destroy everything we built. With that, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the silence, leaving me and Ethan standing in the wreckage of what had once been a home. Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. Are you okay? I shook my head, the tears falling freely now. No, I said, my voice breaking. I don't think I am. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I sobbed against his chest. We'll figure this out, he murmured, his voice steady and calm. I'm not going anywhere. But as I clung to him, the weight of what we had done pressed down on me like a lead blanket. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The life I had known was gone, and I was left to face the consequences of the choices I had made. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a silence steeped in finality. Roger hadn't returned since his outburst, and a part of me knew he wouldn't. I couldn't blame him. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a ghost, unsure of what to do with myself. Ethan tried to comfort me, but even his presence, once so reassuring, now felt like a reminder of everything that had been lost. I sat at the kitchen table one morning, staring into a cold cup of coffee. The sun streamed through the window, painting golden patterns on the floor. But the warmth didn't reach me. Ethan entered the room, his footsteps tentative. He looked at me, his expression a mix of concern and guilt. Have you heard from him? He asked, his voice breaking the stillness. I shook my head. No, and I don't think I will. Ethan sat down across from me, his hands clasped together on the table. I'm sorry, he said softly. For everything. I looked at him, my chest tightening. It's not your fault, I said, though the words felt hollow. I made my choices. I knew what I was doing. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. You don't have to go through this alone. I pulled my hand away, standing abruptly. I need some air, I said, grabbing my coat and heading for the door before he could respond. The neighborhood was quiet as I walked, the crisp autumn air biting at my cheeks. I wandered aimlessly, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have been, what should have been. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me like a stone. By the time I returned home, the sun was beginning to set. I stepped inside to find Ethan sitting on the couch, a book in his hands. He looked up as I entered, relief washing over his face. I was starting to worry, he said. I'm fine, I replied, though I wasn't sure if it was true. I just needed to clear my head. He stood, crossing the room to stand in front of me. I've been thinking, he said, his voice hesitant. Maybe it's time for me to leave. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. What? I asked, my voice trembling. This isn't fair to you, he said, or to Roger. I've done enough damage already. You're not the only one to blame, I said, my chest tightening. I'm just as responsible as you are. I know, he said, his gaze steady, but staying here, it's not helping for either of us. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Deep down, I knew he was right. The longer he stayed, the harder it would be to move on, to rebuild whatever was left of my life. Where would you go? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Soon, he said. Tomorrow, maybe. The thought of him leaving left me feeling hollow, but I nodded, unable to argue. If that's what you think is best. The next morning I helped him pack. We worked in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. When the last of his bags was loaded into his car, he turned to face me, his expression unreadable. I don't regret any of it, he said, his voice soft. Not a single moment. Tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to smile. Neither do I. He stepped closer, pulling me into an embrace. I clung to him, my chest heaving with the effort of holding back sobs. Take care of yourself, he murmured. You too, I whispered. When he finally pulled away, I felt a pang of loss so deep it took my breath away. He climbed into his car, and I watched as he drove down the street, his taillights disappearing into the distance. And just like that, he was gone. The days that followed were some of the loneliest I had ever experienced. The house felt empty without Ethan's presence, and Roger's absence only deepened the void. I spent most of my time in the garden, pulling weeds and planting flowers in an attempt to fill the hours. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the memories lingered, refusing to fade. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Roger. My hands trembled as I opened it, unfolding the crisp sheet of paper. I don't know where to begin. I thought we had a life, a partnership, something worth fighting for, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe we were just two people sharing a house, going through the motions. I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't be here. Not now. Maybe not ever. I hope you find what you're looking for. Take care of yourself, Laura. Tears blurred my vision as I read the letter, each word cutting deeper than the last. I folded it carefully and set it aside, the weight of his goodbye settling over me like a heavy blanket. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly began to regain a semblance of normalcy. The pain didn't disappear, but it dulled, becoming a part of me, a reminder of the choices I had made and the consequences they carried. Ethan sent me a postcard once, from a city halfway across the country. "I'm doing okay. I hope you are too." I kept it tucked away in a drawer, a small piece of him I couldn't bear to let go of. As the seasons changed, so did I. I wasn't the same person I had been before, and I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was living, really living, and maybe that was enough. The first winter after Ethan left felt like an eternity. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the silence in the house deeper than I'd ever known. Roger never came back, his letters serving as the final punctuation mark on a chapter of my life that was both comforting and confining. I was left to reckon with the choices I'd made and the ruins they'd left behind. Everywhere I turned, there were reminders of Ethan. The indentation on the couch where he always sat, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the guest room, even the mug he favored that sat on the drying rack by the sink. At first, these small details felt like daggers to my heart, each one a cruel reminder of what I had lost. But as the weeks turned into months, they became something else, faint echoes of a time when I felt alive, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. One morning, as I sorted through a box of old photos, I came across a picture of Ethan and me from a family barbecue the summer before everything changed. He was laughing, his arm slung casually around my shoulder, while I held a plate of half-eaten ribs. Roger had taken the photo, his voice teasing as he told us to smile. I traced the edges of the picture, my chest tightening. How had it all unraveled so quickly? How had I let it happen? The truth was, I knew the answer. I had spent years feeling invisible, suffocated by the monotony of a marriage that had lost its spark. Ethan had been like a firework in the darkness, illuminating parts of myself I thought had long since died. But fireworks burn bright and fast, leaving only smoke and ash in their wake. I tucked the photo back into the box and closed the lid. Some memories were best left untouched. By spring, the house had started to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a canvas waiting to be repainted. I took up gardening, spending hours in the backyard pulling weeds, planting flowers, and coaxing life out of the soil. It was therapeutic, the act of nurturing something into existence. It gave me a sense of control in a life that had felt so chaotic for so long. One afternoon, as I knelt in the dirt, planting a row of tulips, the sound of the mail truck pulling up to the curb caught my attention. I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, and made my way to the mailbox. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a plain white envelope with no return address. My heart raced as I opened it, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakable. Warren, I hope this finds you well. I've been thinking about you lately, wondering how you're doing, if you've found some kind of peace. I wanted to let you know that I'm okay. I've started a new job, made some friends. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Sometimes I think about that house, the life we shared for a little while. It wasn't much, but it meant everything to me. I hope you know that. Take care of yourself, Ethan. I read the letter twice, then a third time, my hands trembling. It was the first I'd heard from him since the postcard months earlier. The seasons changed again, and with them came a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I began volunteering at the local library, shelving books and helping organize events. It was a small thing, but it gave me purpose, a reason to get out of bed each morning. I even started attending a yoga class at the community center, finding solace in the quiet rhythm of my breath and movement. One evening, after class, a woman approached me as I packed up my mat. Her name was Denise, and she was around my age, with kind eyes and a warm smile. We struck up a conversation about the instructor's eccentric methods, and before I knew it, we were exchanging numbers and making plans for coffee. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time in a long time, I was allowing someone into my life without the weight of guilt or secrecy hanging over me. As the months turned into a year, the house began to transform. I repainted the walls, replaced the furniture, and even got rid of the old dining table where so many tense meals had been shared. It was as though I was exorcising the ghosts of my past, creating a space that felt entirely my own. One day, as I sorted through the last of Roger's belongings, I came across an old notebook tucked away in the back of a drawer. Inside were pages of sketches, landscapes, still lifes, and portraits of people I didn't recognize. They were surprisingly good, each one filled with a level of detail and care that seemed at odds with the man I had known. I sat on the floor, flipping through the pages, a lump forming in my throat. There was so much I hadn't known about Roger, so much I had stopped trying to know. Maybe if I had, things would have been different, or maybe we were always destined to drift apart. Either way, it didn't matter now. What was done was done. By the time summer rolled around again, I felt like a different person. I still thought about Ethan from time to time, wondering where he was and what he was doing, but the ache in my chest had softened, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He had been a part of my life, a fleeting, beautiful, complicated part, and I would always carry that with me, but I couldn't let it define me. One evening, as I sat on the back porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The garden was in full bloom, the tulips and roses swaying gently in the breeze. The air was warm, filled with the scent of earth and flowers, and for the first time in years, I felt content. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe I would stay in this house, building a life piece by piece, or maybe I would sell it, start fresh somewhere new. The possibilities were endless, and for the first time, that didn't scare me. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, and closed my eyes. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. I was more than my mistakes, more than the choices I had made. I was still here, still standing, still capable of finding joy and love and purpose. And maybe that was enough. Sitting on the back porch one warm summer evening, I stared out at the garden I had poured my heart into over the past few months. The tulips I planted in the spring were blooming, their vibrant petals swaying gently in the breeze. The air was thick with the scent of earth and flowers, a reminder of the new life that had emerged from the soil. It was beautiful, serene, but the stillness only deepened the swirl of emotions inside me. For so long I had blamed the world around me for the emptiness I felt. I blamed Roger for his distance, for his inability to see me. I blamed the monotony of our marriage, the weight of unspoken words and unmet needs. And when Ethan came into my life, I told myself that he was the answer. A bright light cutting through the shadows, a chance to feel alive again. But now, in the quiet of this moment, I realized the truth. It wasn't Roger who had made me invisible. It wasn't the routine or the years that dulled my edges. It was me. I had let myself fade, allowed the spark within me to dim because it was easier than facing the deeper questions. Who was I without the roles I had clung to? A wife, a stepmother, a caretaker. But those roles had consumed me, leaving little room for the person I used to be. When Ethan looked at me, I felt seen. I mistook that feeling for love, for connection, but it was something far more complicated. It was a reminder of the version of myself I had lost, the vibrant, passionate woman who once dreamed of so much more. Ethan didn't love me for who I was. He loved the parts of me that reflected his own longing, his own need for meaning. And I had clung to him because I was too afraid to look inward and find that meaning for myself. But now, as the fireflies danced in the fading light, and the warmth of the day lingered on my skin, I understood. The answers I had been searching for weren't in Ethan or Roger or anyone else. They were in me, buried beneath years of doubt and fear. I had to rebuild myself, not as a reflection of someone else's desires, but as a woman who knew her worth, her strength, her capacity to grow. The garden was proof of that. What had once been overgrown and neglected was now bursting with life. I had tended to it with care, with patience, and it flourished. Perhaps, I thought, the same could be true of me. I had to nurture myself, rebuild my foundation, and find joy in this simple act of being. As the first stars appeared in the sky, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The weight of my past would always be there, but it no longer defined me. I was ready to move forward. Alone, but whole.